All right, we are back here visiting the sports legal corner here on the podcast. It's not always we pop in here, but we did have a couple interesting things to discuss this week with our legal analyst, Phil Fraietta. Phil, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mike. I'm happy to be on here talking to you about legal issues that are not related to coronavirus also.
Yes, this is actually what we originally designed the segment for, stuff like this.
Yeah, this is, I think, the first time we've done this in well over a year because of all the coronavirus issues. So I'm excited to get back to normal, so to speak.
Yeah, I have a feeling we'll be talking to you down the line for MLB CBA stuff and figure out what's going on with that. But right now, we're going to talk about two things that have happened in the last week that are of interest to the sports audience here. Number one, we're starting with the NCAA and the Supreme Court, and they had a rough time there last week. Can you explain to me, the audience, what was the NCAA trying to argue in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a drawn-out explanation, but let me start from the very, very beginning of the lawsuit. So the lawsuit challenges the NCAA's ability to restrict payments and other compensation to student athletes. It argues that it's an antitrust violation, antitrust law. You listeners may know it better as monopolies and things like that, but essentially you can't form anti-competitive agreements with your competitors to price people out of a market. So the lawsuit alleges that the NCAA is that. It's an anti-competitive cartel in essence. So the lawsuit got litigated. It went all the way. The trial court issued a decision that said, yeah, the NCAA, they can do that for non-education related benefits, but they can't do it for education related benefits. Then it went up to the Intermediate Appellate Court. The Intermediate Appellate Court agreed, and the NCAA asked the Supreme Court to review it, and the Supreme Court said yes. And the fact that the Supreme Court said yes got people pretty interested. The Supreme Court only takes about 3% of its cases that it's asked to take. They have discretion on which ones to take, and they don't take most of them. And the fact that they took the case was interesting because education-related benefits is a very, very narrow exception to that rule, right? It includes things like scholarships, for instance. The NCAA can't cap the value of the scholarship. But the Supreme Court took the case anyway. So it made people think, well, maybe they want to do more than just this narrow little exception that the other court carved out. And you went up to the Supreme Court, and that's exactly what it sounded like happened at what's called the oral argument. It's essentially the argument like you see on TV where the lawyers argue in court rather than the written submissions that they file prior to it. That argument happened, and based on the questions that the NCAA lawyers were getting from the Supreme Court panel, it sounds like the Supreme Court is prepared to really make a drastic change to college sports. The NCAA tried to argue that, look, this is important to protect the concept of amateurism. And they actually argued that they are supporting competition by restricting these athlete payments because it creates two levels of sports for consumers to watch. You can watch professional sports where the people are paid, or you can watch amateur sports. And their argument was that it's important for us to do that. And, if we can't control the compensation that these guys make, they become professionals. But the Supreme Court panel was just not having it. They were very hard on them, and it was bipartisan. The liberal judges, the conservative judges were, all basically questioning and saying, well, isn't this a cartel? Isn't that what you're doing? You're restricting how much money these guys can make for no real reason. Justice Thomas, who is notorious for not talking, even said, well, does the NCAA have any concern about the college coaches, how much money they make? Because it's well known that, for instance, Nick Saban is the highest paid person in the entire Alabama public system. Nobody makes anywhere near as much money as Nick Saban, including the governor. So That was a question, and essentially the NCAA sounds like they're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I was tweeting with you that day texted you that day when the Supreme Court made the arguments. I mean, you had Clara Thomas talking about how much the coaches make in comparison to the athletes. Justice Kavanaugh basically ripped the model and said this sounds like a monopoly. And I think from the sounds, and knowing that court, they're probably the most conservative justices there, along with Justice Alito, and they were all basically hammering the NCAA. One interesting thing that came out of the arguments to me was that Justice Breyer basically said he's one of the three liberal judges on the panel. He basically said, like, hey, like, this could go down a slippery slope if we open this, and we could have a ton of unintended consequences. What do you think about what he had to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, he's worried about what I touched on at the beginning. If you open this, is there even such a thing as college athletics anymore? And it seems like there's not. And that was one of the arguments that the NCAA made was, hey, wait a minute, we cannot operate if you make us pay the student athletes in some respects. It's going to cost us millions and millions and millions of dollars, if not billions, to the point where we can't have the vast majority of college sports, which, as you know, Mike, are not profitable. I don't think it's a secret, but in case any of the listeners don't know, Iona's not making a lot of money on the field hockey team.
No.
So I'm not sure if field hockey exists if you've got to pay the basketball players. And that was the argument that they made. But from a legal perspective, I'm just not sure if it matters because the law is what it is. And it's clear that these basketball and football players are worth, especially at these powerhouse schools, are worth money in a competitive market. And their ability to earn it is restricted by the NCAA. So I think there's an argument there, and that's what the plaintiffs are arguing. And, it's kind of funny because this all stems back to something that your listeners probably know really well, which is NCAA football, the video game. That's really what kicked off this whole line of litigation. If you remember, they used to make the video game NCAA football, and although they didn't name the players by name, number 15 on Florida was a left-handed quarterback who had speed and was built like a tight end. And everybody knew that was Tim Tebow. So what ended up happening was there was a lawsuit about that said, hey, when they're making this football game, they're using my likeness and my image. It was not Tim Tebow, it was actually a college basketball player who filed the case, but same difference.
Yeah, O'Bannon.
O'Bannon, right. And essentially what EA and the NCAA had to do was say, well, we're just going to stop making the game. Had they just reached a deal then, they probably could have avoided this avalanche of litigation that they've hit. But now they're at a crossroads where if the Supreme Court goes the wrong way, the concept of college sports is going to look very, very different than it does right now.
Yeah, I think there's also two different aspects going on here. Obviously, number one is this, which sort of opens the whole like Pandora's box of like they get paid salaries for like how much time they're putting in here, which we saw a lot of the justice alluding to, as opposed to what's going on right now at some of the state and federal levels. There's this NIL legislation, which is name, like image and likeness. So like, what's the big difference between the two aspects of the law here they're trying to settle here?
So it's kind of like what you said. It's as simple as you said it. So one approach is, yeah, you're going to get paid. How many hours a week does a football player on the Ohio State football team devote to football-based activities? And that would include practice, weight training, conditioning, the game, all the things that go into a typical football week. And then he's going to get paid for his time. That's one way to do it. And to say that time is not time that's being spent for education, right? So, yeah, we're giving you a scholarship to do your classes, and that's all well and good, but in return, you're expected to put in who knows how many hours a week for football purposes. So one way is, well, we're going to pay you. We're going to pay you for the time you put in for football. So if that makes sense. The other way to do it is what you alluded to earlier from the state level, and a lot of states are starting to do this, name, image, likeness, and that's, I can go out there and I can profit off my name, my image, and my likeness. So if that means that Nike wants to give me a nice big sponsorship contract, I can accept that without being punished by the NCAA. If EA Sports wants to create a college football game and put me in it, then I get a cut of the profit. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's two different. They're not mutually exclusive, by the way. You can pay. Professional athletes get both. They get paid for the time they spend on their professional sport, and they get paid their endorsement deals and video and Madden and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes some sense. I think also to put a smaller scale model, people under perspective, something that I know Geo Baker from Rutgers, the point guard, was somebody who's been very vocal on Twitter saying, starting the hashtag not NCAA property. And he's talking about how, like, you know, if you're a music student, you can go sell an album, make money. If you are a computer scientist, you can develop code and sell the code. But if you are Geo Baker and you want to start Geo Baker's basketball camp in his hometown, he can't do it because he's not allowed by the NCAA.
Yep, exactly right. You know, the best example of this might be Mark Zuckerberg. I think everybody knows the story that Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook when he was at college. Well, if he was in a collegiate athlete, he would have been suspended by the NCAA for doing that if he made a single dime on the website. And yeah, why? It's a good point. It's a good question, and a lot of people in the Supreme Court were asking it too. Why? Why does the NCAA have the power to restrict student athletes from earning money that people outside of the university are willing to pay them, whether it be Nike or Gatorade or the local sports camp that you're going to run on the weekends during the summer? Well, why does the NCAA have the ability to restrict me from doing that?
Yeah,
it's a hard one for the NCAA lawyers. Didn't really have a good answer for it, other than, well, the sport would collapse if it wouldn't be, you know, it wouldn't be an amateur sport anymore. It would be a professional sport. That was really the only answer, and I'm not sure that's going to fly legally.
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be a lot of reckoning coming for the NCAA in the next couple of years. Because between that, we have a lot of reckoning in terms of Title IX, trying to promote equity between the men's and the women's sports. This is not I feel like the NCAA is going down a very bad path of what their traditional business model is.
Yes, and that's a good point too that you brought up Title IX, because this is going to pose huge Title IX problems for the NCAA, because the only really profitable college sports that anybody runs is a basketball program and a football program. I don't believe you make any money on any other college sport.
That's correct.
So, and that's for men, not women. So it becomes very, very difficult from a Title IX perspective. Well, now what are we going to do? Are we going to cut the baseball team? Are we going to cut the volleyball team? What are we going to cut to allow us to operate at a profit on men's basketball and men's football? And you need to have some sort of reciprocal female sport. So you can have women's basketball, then you got to have some sort of a women's sport to reciprocate football. It becomes a legal mess. And the NCAA, I think, I alluded to this earlier, I just think that they've approached this poorly. I think they should have tried to settle this dispute years ago, reach some sort of a compromise that would allow them to continue to operate, but they took this line in the sand approach, and it may backfire now.
Yeah, it certainly has. I'll put a pin in that one because that one's going to be something that's going on for a while. The other big news here was Major League...
Yeah, and before we move on, I just wanted to clarify, just so that everybody knows, the Supreme Court will decide this case by the end of June. That's when the term ends. So an opinion will be issued by the Supreme Court before the end of June. So it's coming up.
Yeah, so that's something we'll put a pin in. We can definitely check back in on that once the ruling is made, break down what it means for the NCAA. But the other big news of the week, Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game out of Atlanta and moving it to Colorado. I think this is pretty clear. This is entirely due to the controversial Georgia law, SB 202.
Yeah, Major League Baseball said as much. That's why they did it. So we don't have to speculate. That's what they said.
It is what they said, and I mean, we've seen some of the legal analysts break down SB 202 as a controversial law that's been basically called Jim Crow on steroids by President Biden and by a lot of voting activists, and Republicans basically saying, "Oh, voter security, election security." Like, what is the most controversial aspects of this law in your opinion?
Well, the law has a lot of controversial aspects. I think the most controversial aspect is the context in which it was passed. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the individual provisions of the law and you look at them individually, you'll say, well, that's not so bad. They cut down the days of early voting. Okay, you need an ID to do absentee voting, but if you don't have an ID, you can attest to it and still get away with it. Okay, and things of that sort. So individually, it looks like, well, that's not entirely unreasonable. But when you look at these in the totality, and then you look at the circumstances on which it was passed, it becomes clear, at least to me, that there's some ulterior motives going on here. It looks fishy because this law was passed fresh off what everybody knows was a Democratic sweep in Georgia and a huge upset. Nobody expected Biden to win Georgia. He did. And then both Senate seats flipped Democrat as well. So that was a big surprise. Georgia's historically, at least over the past 50 years or so, been a very red state. So it was a surprise to see that. And as everybody knows, the response from the Trump campaign and a lot in the Republican Party was, well, fraud. There was fraud. There was widespread fraud. And if you followed a lot of the Georgia Republican elected officials, including the Secretary of State, said, no, there wasn't any fraud. It was a fair election. These were the results. And in that context, to come in here and pass a law that is designed to remedy fraud that nobody's been able to find a shred of evidence about seems to suggest that this law isn't really about fraud. It's about trying to secure enough votes on the margin. And what I mean by that is prevent enough Democratic-leaning or people who you assume are going to be Democratic-leaning voters based on demographics from being able to vote for some procedural loophole reason. If you can do that on the margins in a state that's that close, you can turn it back red. And it seems like that was really what was driving the push here. And that's what created the just huge pushback from the president and corporations, including Major League Baseball.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, if you look deeper into the law, I mean, you see things like you can't give anybody in line water or food because then it's a crime. There are laws about reducing number of ballot boxes, like one per county, which that makes a bigger deal in some of these counties that lean more blue, and people used a lot of absentee balloting during COVID last year. And you look at all that stuff, and like you said, on its surface, it seems like, okay, these things seem reasonable. Then you look at all the little loopholes that are thrown in here, like, oh, this provision and so on and so forth. And it just looks and reads like an attempt of we're going to try and make sure that as many people in that African-American group do not vote because that's why we lost the election.
Especially given the context of when this thing was passed. It was passed coming off an election where they lost, they being the Republicans. And there was a narrative of fraud, but no evidence to prove said fraud. So if there's no evidence of fraud, why do we need to change our voting laws to address fraud? Doesn't really add up. And that's why a lot of people have read between the lines here and said, I know what this is. This is your attempt to silence, like you said, the African-American vote. Or at least reduce it enough that we can get back our state and make it red again. And the other aspect of the law that's a little concerning is that certain counties in the state are subject to additional state review. from what I understand. So, and those counties are the big, historically Democratic counties like Fulton County, where Atlanta's located, and the places where, go back to election night. Those were the ones or election week, I should say. Those were the ones where new batch of votes came in. Biden narrows his lead. New batch of votes came in. Biden narrows the lead even more. So it seems like it's clearly designed to go after Democratic votes under the guise of fraud protection.
Yeah, it definitely makes some sense. And I also want to note here also that the response from the Braves was very clearly pointed in terms of they took no shots at the law. They basically blamed the league and said, hey, we had nothing to do with this. You're depriving our economy of this. What do you think of how the Braves responded to the move?
So the Braves are in a tough spot, right? And the reason that what we can do, and we being citizens and in corporations, what they can do is when laws get passed like this, if people don't like it, Major League Baseball moving that All-Star game out is essentially a punishment to the Georgia representatives of, hey, we don't like what you're doing, and now we're going to punish the people of your state. The businesses in your state are going to lose all the revenue that comes in with the Major League Baseball All-Star game. And so the Braves are in a tough spot, right? Because what are they going to do? Are they going to come out and say, yeah, you know what, we agree with this decision? Because if they do that, they really jeopardize and harm their own fan base. So I don't know what they could do other than what they did, which is to kind of say, look, we don't support it. We're sorry for our fans. And because ultimately that is what happens. And it's a little upsetting in that respect, right? Because the people who are going to suffer from this decision are not the guys in the Georgia legislature who passed this law. It's the guy who owns the bar down the street from the hotel where people were going to be staying for the All-Star game. And the guy who had tickets to the home run derby and was going to bring his 8-year-old son. Those are the people who really suffer.
Yeah, it's certainly fair. I also do want to give credit to the league here. This is the right decision to make, because I get that this is a much different environment than they had 10 years ago, because 2011 they were facing heat because of controversial immigration laws in Arizona when the All-Star game was at Chase Field. They opted to leave the game there. But given the way the climate has evolved in this time with all of the movement, especially in terms of the Get Out the Vote initiative, MLB would have had a huge PR problem. They left the game there, because you would have the potential of stars like Mookie Betts saying, I'm not going. You could have Dave Roberts, the manager of the Dodgers, say, I'm not going. You could have had a lot of PR nightmares. And I think it was good for the league to actually back up its prong and say, hey, we support getting the vote out and not just playing it lip service by leaving the game there.
No, I think MLB made the right decision too. And I don't want to be construed as saying they didn't. MLB doesn't have the power to say that we're going to overturn the Georgia election law. So they did what they could do, which is, you want to pass a law like that, that's fine. We're going to take our All-Star game, we're going to move it elsewhere. And that's really the only thing they could do. So, and I agree that it was the right decision. I think they avoid a PR nightmare. I think they actually come out ahead. And I also think it was a good decision from a collective bargaining perspective. You alluded to that earlier. That's, as everybody knows, the CBA is coming up. That's going to be a heated negotiation. And now at least you don't have the players saying, hey, you wouldn't even give us the All-Star game when we told you we were upset about it. At least you can get past that issue and have some showing of good faith that you guys can agree on certain things.
Yeah, I do think we've seen a lot of times these controversial laws, the sports tends to be the precursor to try and bring about change. I remember back in 1993, the Super Bowl got pulled out of Arizona because the voters there refused to recognize Martin Luther King Day as a national holiday. Back in 2017, the NCAA moved all of its championships out of North Carolina. The NBA pulled the All-Star game out of Charlotte after a controversial law that was discriminating against the LGBT population. I mean, this sort of feels like the natural extension of that, and I think there's a lot of pressure on the next big thing would be the SEC championship. It's always been in Atlanta. I think the SEC, which recently as last year, finally made its pressure in Mississippi to change the Confederate flag. get it off the state buildings. Now I think they're going to have a lot of heat on them if this law isn't changed to get that game out of Atlanta.
Yeah, and like you said, this works. North Carolina, you mentioned that law got overturned a couple of years later. That's no longer the law in North Carolina. It related to transgender individuals and what bathrooms they had to use. Well, that law was repealed. Doesn't exist anymore. And that's in part because of the backlash they faced from sports, including the NCAA and the NBA. And these are meaningful things. They're huge revenue grabs for cities. And if you move the game out of there, it hurts the state of Georgia. So we'll see how this plays out. I know that there's been a rallying cry from some conservative voices in America to boycott Major League Baseball, boycott Coca-Cola, boycott anybody who has a problem with this Georgia law. And we'll see. I mean, there's obviously, a large chunk of the country will be sympathetic to that position. And we'll see if people will boycott Major League Baseball over it. I saw what was kind of ironic was what happened in Texas on opening day. As we talked about, they had this full capacity, no masks, 2019 looking baseball game. And they invited the governor to throw out the first pitch, and he said no because of the All-Star game situation, which is actually kind of ironic because the only reason that you had the whole maskless huge gathering is because of the governor, because he allowed it. So it's a little ironic, but that's where we are, and I think that Major League Baseball has the power to be a voice of change for things, and I'm glad to see them step up. And the last thing I'll say on it is, I know a lot of listeners are probably saying, well, I don't want politics in my sports. I just want to watch the game. And I get it. I'm sympathetic to that. I don't think anybody wants politics in sports. But at some level, don't you just have to admit that it's there and it's always going to be there? It's not going away.
Oh yeah, it's always been there in some shape or form. It's not just loud. It's not just louder than other times. I do think there are two other things to keep track here with this aspect of this situation here. Number one is as we've seen, the whole lie about voter fraud. I mean, there's more laws floating around like this in state legislators in the country in response to the Trump campaign's voter fraud lie. So that number one thing is track here is if more of these get passed, and the MLB was smartly picked Colorado, which probably has some of the easiest voter access laws in the nation, to sort of make the point here to Atlanta and the state of Georgia. If more get passed, you have to wonder how many leaders start having to pull out of other places if they're extreme as this law.
Yeah, I think that's right. And let's take a step back and say, well, why are all these bills pending? And they're pending for a really simple reason. You called it the voter fraud lie, and I agree with that characterization. But if you look at opinion polling, there are a large percentage of Republicans in America who don't think it's a lie. They believe it. They truly believe that Donald Trump would have won the election but for this widespread fraud. So if you're a Republican state legislature, or you want to be able to tell your constituents, hey, I did something about it. I proposed Senate Bill 205, and that bill was going to get rid of the fraud. There's going to be no more fraud in our state. And those bills are going to get pushed. They may pass in other parts of the country, and it's going to be really interesting to see how sports react to it. Are they going to move everything to states that don't go along with that? Or I don't know. It's interesting. Georgia is the first to do it. It's the most high profile one because of what happened with the election and the president and the phone calls to the Secretary of State asking him to change the numbers and things like that. So former president, I should say. So yeah, we will see how this shapes up, but I think more of these laws are going to go into effect. But we'll see. Now, what I'll say now is that, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but what I'll say is, if you're a legislator in another state considering one of these bills and you see the backlash that happened in Georgia, maybe you reconsider it.
Yeah, something got to be some calculus in the equation here. I also think the other thing I want to touch on before you go is Greg Abbott in Texas, the governor. Obviously, he pulled out of throwing out the opening pitch in protest of the law. He also made this big claim that Major League Baseball is no longer welcome to host its big events there. Remember last year they did the neutral site bubble in Texas for the playoffs. He basically said, "Hey, baseball is non grata outside of our Astros and Rangers games." So, do you think this threat has any legs?
No, Greg Abbott cannot prevent Major League Baseball from hosting an event in the state of Texas. He has no power to do that. That's just political grandstanding, virtue signaling. That's all that is. He has no power to do that. Governor Abbott should, in my opinion, just keep his mouth shut. And you know what, Governor? Clearly, the people of your state want to watch baseball because almost 40,000 of them packed themselves in to watch a bad Texas Rangers team on opening day. So I'm just seems to me like the boycott is not in full effect.
Yeah, I'm going to get on the soapbox second with the boycott. It just seems so ridiculous because, and as somebody who has like voted on the right in the past, I mean, the amount of things that the right wants you to boycott right now, whether it's Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, Coca-Cola, Home Depot, so like Delta, so on and so forth. It means like, at what point, like, is there anything left for you to do if you're on the right? Because it sounds like everything's against you.
You sent me a tweet from, and I don't remember who tweeted it, but it was a pretty good argument. And I'm trying not to get too political here, but for a party that markets itself as, we're the patriotic party, we love America. Well, what do you like about America? Because it seems like you hate all of our
Sports.
traditions, our pastimes, our corporations. So what exactly do you like about America? I'm a little confused.
I am too, because I mean, like, it's basically like, don't watch movies, don't watch sports, don't buy like some of these brands. Like, I'm just confused. I don't know what I'm supposed to be liking here.
Look, I think, and again, it's a little ironic because 20 years ago, it would have been the people on the left who were saying, well, look, America has no culture. Our culture is sports and movies and Coca-Cola. But now it's the right who's saying, well, don't watch sports, don't watch movies, and don't drink Coca-Cola. So it's kind of funny how it's flipped on its head that now the left is embracing the sports and the movies and the Coca-Cola, when 20 years ago that was not the case. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not sure what they're looking for. It's really concerning to me, at least, that we're going down that path. It's ironic. It's really ironic when you consider the whole cancel culture movement, and we don't believe in cancel culture. Well, sounds like you do believe in cancel culture because you're trying to cancel all these corporations for doing stuff that you don't agree with, which, hey, is your right. But I don't know. I'm not really sure where they're going with this one. But I think that what Major League Baseball is trying to do is, and Coca-Cola and Delta and so on and so forth, they're trying to show these states, look, we have a voice, and if you want to make these decisions, that's fine, but understand the consequences to the people of your state.
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to stop that there. I don't think we go any further down the rabbit hole. But Phil, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Like I said, it was nice to talk about some non-coronavirus related legal issues in sports.
100%.
So I'll look forward to talking to you again soon, and hopefully we can talk some baseball next time.